didn't make it. And it's a great pleasure and an honor to do that. Jomo, as you know, or you may not, if you don't know, Jomo is one of those unfortunate people who are condemned by their names to end up worrying about something. His father gave him two names, Jomo and Kwame. And he's from Malaysia, so he's been stuck since then, having to think about Africa. And for as long as I've known Jomo, his concern for Africa, both as a political project and as an intellectual project, has been very, very strong, and he's maintained that. But also I think it says a lot about, since we were reminiscing about the good old days, how these nationalists, like Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah, the resonance they had globally, that somebody way out in Malaysia would name their son after two great Africans. And fortunately for us, the name was given to a great African. It could have been worse, it could have been given the wrong person. He's now the Assistant Secretary General in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and which in a sense speaks well of the UN. I can say it now that I'm no longer in the UN. The UN is so disorganized. The discrete charm of the UN is so disorganized that a lot of interesting ideas slip through. This wouldn't happen at the World Bank, for instance, where there's much tighter control of the content of what people write. And so you do have, and for those of you may have an opportunity to read the intellectual history of the UN, it's a 9-10 volume. It's quite amazing how many good people have worked and influenced, at least been given space to express themselves within the UN system. And I attribute that partly to, not because the UN is more Catholic, but partly to just the confusion of the UN. There's more space when there's confusion. Jomo's work is incredibly wide-ranging, and it'd be really, it would need a special 2-3 days conference to look at his work. But two parts of his work that have always surprised me, and I've enjoyed reading. One, he has been very concerned with the theories of development in the strict sense of the word, and what that means for the well-being of large part of humanity. And he has done that with enormous rigor. And I think there's one thing we can learn from Jomo, is that you have to know your enemy thoroughly. And Jomo is a very well entrenched, and very well read and very well respected economist in that sense. And constantly I still get a little, if there's an interesting article that comes up somewhere, that we'll get Jomo sends a message to colleagues to read this, and this will be what might look sometimes just conventional economic story, but which he would want that we understand and critically look at it. So his work on the developmental experience of Asia, especially the role of developmental state, is outstanding, and one of the most remarkable readings, I hope, can be made compulsory reading in African universities, was on the question of rent-seeking and development. The biggest argument used in Africa against any state involvement, there have been two arguments. One, that Africa is rent-seeking, and rent-seeking is bad for development and so forth. And Jomo's work demonstrates very clearly that you cannot understand the Asian developmental state if you don't understand the allocation of rents. And that in our case, they say patrimonialism, clientelism, and also he points out, well, you cannot understand the Asian development experience without understanding the very complex relationship between the state and its national capital. But he does that with elegance and enormous rigor. He is very active in all kinds of networks, and currently we share a same network. He's the chairperson of the Ideas Network. It's a network of economists trying to organize, try to bring in more heterodox thinking into the issue, the question of development. And right now he has a problem which might always blow up in his face, is that he was sued for $100 million by the richest man in Malaysia. And I asked him whether he wants any contributions from us here to sort out this problem. He said we can wait, but I think the case has been cancelled now because they changed judges. So and he told me that his country is one of the best judiciary money can buy. He was banned for 17 years from Singapore for all kinds of reasons. And I remember when we were talking about his appointment in the UN, there was a question about that, whether that would affect whether Singapore would make noise about his appointment, and for some reason they didn't. But anyway, we are here first. We're here we're going to be listening to a great scholar.
Thank you very much, Thandika, for those very kind words of introduction, and thank you to CODESRIA. I'm not prepared to make remarks about Sheikh Anta Diop, but purely by chance, I actually met his younger brother recently, and I have learned a great deal more about Sheikh Anta Diop's contributions. But today's lecture is essentially in the spirit of what in Malaysia is called an emergency midwife. When the normal midwife is not available, a woman is about to deliver a child, you have an emergency midwife. And so I'm the emergency midwife, and I hope I will not do emergency midwives discredit in this role. Let me begin by suggesting to you what is the inspiration for what I would like to remark on. In recent years, as you know, there have been several major developments, and let me focus only on three. And it is these three recent developments which I think are of significance to us here. As you all know, since about 8 years ago, it has been said that Africa is facing a new revival. Economically, Africa has been starting to grow again after a quarter of a century of stagnation. And this is said to be the new hope for the future. There was even some talk about this century being Africa's century. This is, of course, a very important development, something which we need to understand and to make sense of. The second important development recently, of course, is the crisis which began in 2007 and 2008. And I'm particularly proud to be associated with two of the three organizations which anticipated the crisis. The third organization being the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. But besides the United Nations, where I had just started work and we were trying to understand recent trends, and we were very concerned with the likely implications of financial liberalization and financial globalization. And unfortunately, our concerns turned out to be quite real. And the other organization I have been working with and helping with is something called the G24. The G24 is the caucus of developing countries in Washington at the Bretton Woods institutions, at the IMF and the World Bank. And the G24 in early 2007 actually came out with a short paper. I called it a policy brief, basically warning about the likelihood of the US housing bubble bursting and the full implications and the likely implications of the consequences of that housing bubble bursting. Now, of course, as you all know, we are now in a very different phase of the crisis. We are now in a situation where Europe, the continent, is facing much of the medicine which many of us in developing countries have been swallowing for the last few decades, the last 3 decades. And this, of course, changes things radically. It, of course, on the one hand, means that possibilities for reform which were not previously there, might now be there precisely because the people who are suffering as a consequence of these kinds of policy conditionalities are much more widespread than ever before. But the other point, of course, which is very important, is that we are in a situation of the absence of leadership. If you think about the 1930s and the failure of leadership in the 1930s to deal with the Great Depression, we saw a period of protracted rise of fascism, of militarism, and eventually the Second World War, with all its devastating consequences. And although this is not imminent at the present moment, we have seen some very, very ugly developments in many parts of the world, and especially in the North Atlantic region, which we need to be concerned about. The third element, which I think is important for us to consider very, very seriously, is really the fact that we now face multiple challenges, including the likelihood of continued global warming and its implications for human existence and for the existence of nature as well, and what all that implies. And we need to be able to address these multiple challenges in ways which are coherent and which, unfortunately, we do not see the leadership for coming from other parts of the world. So in this regard, I do think we have a very huge challenge, a huge opportunity to try to understand these developments. But let me proceed now by trying to recall the recent past, because I think we run the risk of making very serious mistakes if we do not learn from the past. I think the first thing to recall, of course, is that the sorry state of African economic development, particularly from the late 1970s until the early part of the last decade, was something which was not a permanent condition of Africa. Because in the 1960s and 1970s, during the first decades after decolonization, Africa actually was doing much better than it had been doing before the middle of the last decade. And without going into any detail on this table, I think you get a sense of it if you had a chance to look at the table. I think the other thing to remember, of course, is that there have been some very, very important developments. The kinds of the situation which Africa found itself in, partly because it was relatively late in terms of embarking on industrialization, late in terms of trying to promote rural development and so on and so forth. What we find is that the consequences of the oil price increase during the 1970s and also the other kinds of the impacts of the other developments which were taking place at that time, especially the stagflation of the West, was very important in terms of inhibiting the growth and the continued growth and development of Africa. All this was not helped, but actually made worse by the structural adjustment programs which were introduced in Africa during the period of the 1980s and 1990s. Almost 1,000 structural adjustment programs were introduced in Africa, and you saw as a consequence a decline in per capita income in the continent during the first half of the 1990s, for example, of about 0.3% per annum on average. Now, the typical policy conditionalities in Africa at that time are very familiar to you, and it's something which bears reflection upon, because it's precisely what is happening in Europe right now. Cuts in public spending, restraints on credit, higher interest rates, the elimination of subsidies, all of which resulted in a reduction of demand, in income, of output, and of course economic stagnation. Sub-Saharan Africa's trade balances certainly did not improve over this period, despite the heavy costs which were faced. Now, it's one of the very important